Blood does not wash easily from the titanium floors of an orbital refinery. For 20 years, we scrubbed the stains of our own people under the boots of the Ascendancy. Today, the scrubbing stops. Today, a single fractured human knee refuses to bend, and the galaxy breaks instead. The air on Sector 4 of the Aegis Prime orbital facility tasted constantly of copper and shattered quartz. It was a suffocating metallic tang that coated the back of the throat and settled deep within the lungs, a daily reminder of humanity's current place in the cosmic hierarchy. Caleb breathed it in, feeling the familiar rhythmic sting in his chest as he hauled a 50-pound crate of refined dark matter isotopes up the loading ramp. His muscles screamed, trembling under the station's artificially inflated gravity set to 1.4 Gs to accommodate the dense, towering physiques of their conquerors. It had been 20 years since the sky over Earth turned a bruised, apocalyptic purple. Caleb still remembered the day the Ascendancy arrived. He had been a senior structural engineer for Lockheed Martin's Deep Space Division, working on the Artemis lunar grid. He remembered watching the monitors in stunned silence as the highly classified Raytheon orbital defense platforms, the absolute pinnacle of human military engineering, were swatted aside like fragile glass ornaments. The massive dreadnought fleets, quietly bankrolled by the remnants of BlackRock and Vanguard to protect Earth's private interests, burned in the upper atmosphere. Trillions of dollars of military supremacy turned into a rain of molten slag over the Pacific Ocean in less than 3 hours. SpaceX's sprawling Martian colonies went dark 20 minutes later. Humanity was fundamentally, categorically outmatched. Now, Caleb was simply Unit 884 Delta. He was a slave, property of the Ascendancy, tasked with mining and processing the very fuels that powered the warships, keeping his species in chains. He dropped the crate at the designated sorting bay, wiping a mixture of sweat and toxic gray dust from his brow. Beside him, a younger human named Dominic struggled to lift his own crate. Dominic was barely 19, born in the belly of a transport ship, a child of the occupation who had never seen the blue skies of Earth or felt the warmth of an unfiltered sun. "Keep your back straight, kid," Caleb muttered, stepping closer to take some of the weight from the boy's trembling arms. "Lift from the hips. You blow a disc in your spine out here, the medical drones won't fix it. They'll just recycle you." Dominic gritted his teeth, his pale face flushed red with exertion. "I can't. The gravity. It feels heavier today, Caleb." "It's the same as yesterday," Caleb lied gently, taking the brunt of the crate's weight and shoving it onto the magnetic conveyor belt. "You're just tired. Keep your head down. Shift ends in 2 hours." Before Dominic could reply, the sharp electric crack of a plasma whip echoed through the cavernous loading bay. Both men flinched. Striding down the catwalk above them was Garrick. Garrick was human, but you wouldn't know it from the cold, dead look in his eyes. When the Ascendancy conquered Earth, they quickly realized they didn't have the manpower to oversee billions of prisoners. They offered privileges, better food, lighter gravity quarters, basic medical care to any human willing to hold the whip. Garrick was one of the first to volunteer. "Did I authorize a break, Unit 884? Garrick sneered, leaning over the rusted railing, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his plasma baton. He wore the gray and silver uniform of an Ascendancy overseer, impeccably clean, a stark contrast to the rags the slaves wore. "No, overseer," Caleb said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He kept his eyes glued to the grated floor. Eye contact was considered a challenge, and a challenge meant a week in the sensory deprivation cubes. "Then why are your hands empty, Delta?" Garrick tapped his baton against the railing. Sparks rained down, hissing as they hit the damp floor. "The quota for Sector 4 is up by 10% today. Lord Valerius is making a planetary inspection. Everything must be perfect. If this bay is short on its output, I will personally throw the lot of you into the atmospheric incinerators." "We understand, Overseer," Caleb said, stepping back and pulling Dominic with him. "It won't happen again." Garrick stared at them for a long, suffocating moment, seemingly searching for a reason to ignite his whip. Finally, he scoffed, turning on his heel. "Get back to work, filth." When Garrick's footsteps faded into the ambient roar of the refinery, Dominic let out a shaky breath. "I hate him," the boy whispered, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. "I hate him more than the aliens." "Don't waste your energy on hate," Caleb said softly. turning back to the heavy lifting. Hate burns calories. We don't get enough rations to afford that. Just survive, Dom. That's the only rebellion we have left. But even as Caleb said it, the words tasted like ash in his mouth. Survival felt less like a victory and more like a prolonged surrender. For 2 decades, he had kept his head down. He had watched his colleagues executed, his world stripped bare, and his wife, Sarah, perish from untreated radiation sickness in the early days of the mining camps. He had swallowed his pride, his anger, and his humanity, compacting it all into a tight, dark ball deep within his chest. He had convinced himself he was surviving. But as he looked at the massive, sweeping archways of the alien station, constructed from the melted steel of Earth's greatest cities, Caleb realized a terrifying truth. He wasn't surviving. He was just taking a very long time to die, and the reservoir of his patience, deep as it had been, was beginning to run terrifyingly dry. 3 days later, the piercing shriek of the station's klaxons shattered the exhausted silence of the slave barracks. It wasn't the standard double chime that signaled a shift change, nor was it the stuttering wail of a hull breach. This was a sustained, agonizingly loud harmonic chord that vibrated the very fillings in Caleb's teeth. "Up! Everyone on your feet!" Garrick's voice boomed through the integrated public address system, artificially amplified and dripping with frantic authority. "Standard cycle is suspended. All units are to report to the Grand Atrium immediately. Form up by sector. Move, move, move." Around Caleb, thousands of humans dragged themselves from their thin synthetic cots. Bodies bruised, scarred, and malnourished moved with the sluggish synchrony of the condemned. Caleb pulled on his gray work tunic, his joints popping in protest. "What is it?" Dominic whispered, standing next to Caleb, his eyes wide with a fear that he hadn't yet learned to suppress. "Are they venting the barracks? Are we being purged?" No, an older man named Josiah rasped from the bunk across from them. Josiah had been a prominent neurosurgeon in Boston before the fall. Now, his hands shook too much to hold a spoon, let alone a scalpel. "It's a supplication rite." The rumors were true. A high arbiter of the ascendancy has arrived. Lord Castor. Caleb's jaw tightened. He knew of the supplication rites. The ascendancy was not merely a military empire. It was a civilization built upon absolute, unyielding hierarchy. Their entire societal structure was predicated on the concept of dominant and submissive biology. To the ascendancy, humanity was not just a defeated enemy. We were a lesser species, biologically destined to serve. To reinforce this, the ascendancy periodically mandated the rites massive, broadcasted spectacles where millions of slaves across the galaxy were forced to kneel simultaneously in the presence of an ascendant lord. It was a psychological weapon, designed to break the spirit so completely that the very idea of rebellion became physiologically impossible. To ensure compliance, the ascendancy had weaponized humanity's own technology against them. Around the neck of every slave sat a thick, metallic collar. They were repurposed iterations of Neuralink prototypes, seized from Earth's corporate laboratories during the invasion. The aliens had modified the technology, turning it into a localized neural dampener. It didn't just shock you if you misbehaved. It directly interfaced with the brain stem. If an overseer pushed a button, the collar could artificially sever motor function, flood the brain with liquid agony, or simply turn off the heart. "Listen to me, both of you," Josiah said, his voice trembling as they shuffled out into the massive, echoing corridors, joining a river of gray-clad humanity. "When the order comes, you drop. You don't hesitate. You don't look up. You let your knees hit the deck and you empty your mind. Do not let them see anger in your eyes." The neural collars monitor biometric spikes. If your heart rate elevates with aggression, the collar will trigger. Caleb touched the cold metal ring around his throat. He had worn it for 20 years. It was a part of him now, heavier than the gravity, colder than the void of space. The march to the Grand Atrium took nearly an hour. The atrium was a staggering architectural marvel. A cavernous dome large enough to house a small city, constructed of polished black obsidian and illuminated by the harsh, artificial light of a captive star reactor suspended at its zenith. Over 100,000 humans were herded into the space, arranged in perfect, symmetrical geometric grids. Above them, hovering on anti-gravity platforms, were the Ascendancy Elite Guard. They were terrifying figures, standing nearly 8 feet tall, clad in ornate ceremonial armor that seemed to absorb the light. Their faces were hidden behind faceless, mirrored visors. At the far end of the atrium, a massive dais rose from the floor. Atop it stood Lord Castor. Even from a distance, the alien radiated an aura of crushing authority. He didn't wear armor, but rather flowing robes of deep crimson and gold. His species was humanoid, but elongated, predatory, with pale, translucent skin and eyes that burned with a cold, bioluminescent blue. A floating holocam droid drifted through the cavernous space, broadcasting the event to billions of Ascendancy citizens across the sector. This was a show of power, a theatrical display of the taming of Earth. Garrick paced at the front of Caleb's block, his plasma baton deactivated but tightly gripped. He was sweating profusely, desperate to impress his alien masters. Perfect silence, Garrick hissed into his comms unit, his voice echoing in the earpieces of his sector. I swear to God, if a single one of you embarrasses me, I will make the rest of your short lives a waking nightmare. A deep, resonant hum vibrated through the floorboards. It was the ceremonial gong of the Ascendancy. Lord Castor stepped forward to the edge of the dais. He did not speak into a microphone. His voice was projected through the station's localized acoustic field, ensuring every syllable struck the human eardrums with physical force. Creatures of Terra, Castor's voice boomed, translated perfectly into English by the station's AI. It was a voice devoid of malice, which somehow made it infinitely worse. It was the tone of a gardener addressing weeds. You exist by the grace of the Ascendancy. Your labor fuels our expansion. Your obedience ensures your continued survival. You have been stripped of your violent past, elevated from your primitive squalor, and given purpose within the grand design. Today, you acknowledge your place. Today, you honor your betters. Castor paused, raising one long, slender hand. The holocams zoomed in on him. Across the galaxy, an empire of conquerors watched in eager anticipation. Assume the posture of submission, Castor commanded, his voice echoing like thunder. Kneel. The command was absolute. It was not a request. It was a mandate coded into the very air they breathed. Instantly, the sound of 100,000 human bodies dropping to the obsidian floor echoed through the atrium like a tidal wave crashing against a cliff. It was a horrific, synchronized thud of flesh and bone striking hard stone. Beside Caleb, Dominic dropped immediately, burying his face into his hands. Josiah went down heavily, his old knees cracking audibly in the oppressive silence that followed. All across the sprawling, cavernous expanse, an ocean of gray uniforms flattened themselves against the ground. The Ascendancy elite guard looked on with bored indifference. Garrick had dropped to one knee, bowing his head in reverent servitude. It was a perfect, flawless display of absolute psychological destruction. Except for one glaring, catastrophic anomaly. In the dead center of Sector 4, standing like a solitary pillar of defiance in a graveyard of broken spirits, was Caleb. He hadn't moved. His boots remained planted firmly on the black glass floor. His back, scarred from years of labor, was straight. His chin was up. His eyes, burning with a quiet, terrifying intensity, were locked dead ahead, staring directly at the distant figure of Lord Castor. For a second, nobody noticed. The sheer impossibility of a slave remaining standing during the supplication rite was so profound that the alien mind simply failed to process the visual data. It was like watching water flow upwards. Then, the biometric alarms triggered. The Neuralink collar around Caleb's neck flared from a dull green to an angry, flashing crimson. The automated systems had detected a failure to comply and a massive spike in aggressive neurochemicals. The protocol was simple: force compliance. A pulse of raw, agonizing electricity shot directly into Caleb's brainstem. It was designed to overload the motor cortex, instantly turning the legs to jelly. It was the same tech that had brought Earth's greatest soldiers to their knees in the final days of the war. Caleb staggered. His vision flashed violently white. The pain was indescribable, a hot iron driven straight through the base of his skull, down his spine, and into his boots. His knees buckled, dropping an inch. "Just let go," a voice in the back of his mind whispered. "Just kneel. It's not worth it. You're going to die." But as his knee dipped toward the floor, The memories surged forward. He saw the Raytheon defense grid burning. He saw the executives of the Earth's megacorporations trading human lives for a chance to board escape shuttles that were shot down anyway. He saw his wife Sarah, coughing blood into a rag, looking up at him with eyes that had lost all hope. He remembered the 20 years of dust, the beatings, the quiet, suffocating degradation of his species. He remembered that he was human. And humans were not built to break so easily. As the caller pumped excruciating voltage into his nervous system, Caleb's biology reacted. The human body is an evolutionary marvel of survival, capable of terrifying feats under extreme duress. A massive, unprecedented surge of adrenaline and cortisol flooded Caleb's bloodstream. His heart rate skyrocketed to 180 beats per minute. His fight-or-flight response, suppressed for 2 decades, detonated like a thermonuclear device inside his chest. The Neuralink collar, designed around corporate medical parameters to control mild seizures and enforce compliance, was suddenly trying to dam a raging river with a chain-link fence. The human nervous system was simply too dense, too flooded with natural stimulants. With a guttural, primal snarl that tore through the silent atrium, Caleb forced his legs straight. Muscles tore in his thighs. Blood vessels burst in his left eye, turning the sclera a violent red. Smoke literally began to curl from the metal collar around his neck as its microprocessors overheated. Unable to overcome the sheer, raw, bioelectrical willpower of a human being pushed past the point of no return, he stood up, fully, defiantly. A collective gasp echoed from the thousands of slaves around him. Dominic peered through his fingers, his eyes widening in pure terror and awe. Josiah openly wept. On the dais, Lord Castor froze. The alien's bioluminescent eyes flared with confusion, then mounting outrage. The holocams, programmed to track anomalies, had automatically locked onto Caleb, projecting his bloody, snarling, standing figure onto the massive screens above the atrium and out across the galactic network. "Unit 884! Garrick screamed, his voice breaking into a hysterical, high-pitched squeal. He scrambled up from his kneeling position, drawing his plasma baton. "Get down! Get down on your knees, you insane son of a bitch! You're gonna kill us all." Garrick lunged, bringing the crackling energy whip down toward the back of Caleb's legs. Caleb didn't even look at him. As the baton came down, Caleb's arm shot out with a speed born of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. He caught Garrick's wrist mid-swing. The overseer's eyes went wide with shock. Slaves didn't fight back. They couldn't fight back. With a sharp, brutal twist, Caleb shattered Garrick's wrist. The bone snapped with a loud crack that echoed across the silent room. Garrick dropped the baton, shrieking in pain, and fell to his knees. Caleb stood over the whimpering collaborator, the smoking collar still clamped around his neck, sparking and fizzing as it slowly short-circuited. He looked up, past the elite guards, past the holocams, and locked eyes with Lord Castor. The High Arbiter stepped forward, his crimson robes swirling around him. The air in the atrium grew impossibly thick. Castor raised his hand, signaling the elite guards to hold their fire. He wanted to understand this anomaly. He wanted to break it personally. Castor's voice boomed through the acoustic field, no longer calm, but laced with a venomous, alien fury. What is the meaning of this malfunction? Why does the Terran beast not bend? Kneel, slave. Kneel, or I will glass the sector you stand upon. Caleb kicked the deactivated plasma baton away from Garrick's writhing body. The blood from his ruptured eye dripped down his cheek, tracing a crimson path through 20 years of isotopic dirt. He took a deep, rattling breath, feeling the burning air fill his lungs. He felt lighter than he had in decades. The gravity hadn't changed, but the weight of his fear was gone. He looked at the alien lord, opened his mouth, and spoke a single word. He didn't need an acoustic amplifier. The sheer force of his voice carried it across the suffocating silence. No. It was a simple word, but it was a word the Ascendancy had never heard from a subjugated race. It was a word that struck the alien empire not as an insult, but as a structural failure of their reality. And as the word echoed off the obsidian walls, the red light on Caleb's collar flared one final time, sparked violently, and died, unlocking with a sharp clack and falling uselessly to the floor. Caleb Harper was no longer a slave. And the silence that followed was not the silence of submission. It was the deep, terrifying breath before a hurricane. The word hung in the air, a physical entity that seemed to fracture the artificial light of the grand atrium. No. For a fraction of a second, the universe held its breath. Lord Castor's bioluminescent blue eyes widened, the vertical slits of his pupils contracting in shock. The Ascendancy's entire sociological model, their unblemished record of absolute galactic domination, had just collided with the sheer, stubborn density of the human spirit. "Execute him," Castor whispered. Then, realizing his voice had failed to carry, he screamed it, his composure shattering. "Obliterate that creature! Kill him and broadcast his remains!" Above the sea of kneeling humans, two elite guards disengaged their anti-gravity platforms. They plummeted toward the obsidian floor like armored meteorites, the hydraulic servos in their legs absorbing the massive impact. They were towering nightmares of predatory bioengineering clad in dark matter alloy. One raised a heavy plasma caster, the weapon humming as it drew power from its core. Caleb didn't freeze. The adrenaline currently screaming through his veins was a potent cocktail of survival instinct, and 2 decades of compressed, agonizing rage. He was a structural engineer, a man who had spent his life analyzing stress points, load-bearing vectors, and the inevitable failure of rigid systems. And right now, the Ascendancy was just another rigid system. He dove to his right, his hands scrambling across the slick floor, and closed his fingers around the hilt of the plasma baton he had kicked away from Garrick. He rolled just as a bolt of superheated blue plasma vaporized the space where he had stood seconds before. The shockwave of the blast threw him backward, singeing his tunic and blistering the skin of his shoulder, but he kept his grip on the weapon. "Stay down!" Caleb roared at the humans around him, igniting the baton. A furious, crackling blade of pure thermal energy hissed into existence. The first elite guard lunged, moving with a terrifying fluid speed despite the 1.4 G gravity. It swung a massive, gauntleted fist aimed squarely at Caleb's chest. But Caleb knew Earth technology. He knew that the aliens, for all their supposed superiority, lacked creativity. They had conquered Earth and immediately assimilated its infrastructure, grafting their own weapons onto stolen human frameworks. The hydraulic mesh operating the guard's heavy armor was a direct ripoff of Boston Dynamics' heavy-load exoskeleton schematics, seized during the fall of DARPA's underground Seattle facility. Caleb knew exactly where the shear pins were located. He didn't try to block the punch that would have shattered his arms. Instead, he dropped into a slide, ducking beneath the massive swing, and thrust the searing plasma baton upward, driving it directly into the unarmored joint behind the guard's heavy knee. The alien shrieked, a horrific clicking sound that grated against the human ear. The Boston Dynamics hydraulic fluid superheated instantly, exploding outward in a spray of boiling vapor. The guard's leg buckled, the sheer weight of its own armor dragging it down. Before the towering creature could recover, Caleb spun, using his own momentum to drive the baton straight into the ventilation grill beneath the guard's mirrored visor. The alien slumped, dead before it hit the floor. Silence slammed back into the atrium, heavier and more suffocating than before. A human, a malnourished, overworked slave, had just killed an Ascendancy elite guard in single combat. But something else was happening. Something invisible, yet infinitely more dangerous. When the Ascendancy had repurposed the Neuralink collars to control the human populace, they had utilized the underlying architecture of Palantir's Gotham Matrix, a heavily encrypted, localized mesh network designed to share data instantaneously across battlefield units. The aliens hadn't bothered to rewrite the core code. They had simply used the mesh to ensure synchronized obedience. If one collar received an update, they all did. When Caleb's biological override, his massive spike in heart rate, adrenaline, and pure electrical rage had forced his collar to short circuit, it hadn't just died. It had screamed. It had sent a catastrophic error code, a localized EMP feedback loop, directly into the Palantir mesh. All around Caleb, humans began to gasp. Dominic, still kneeling, clawed at his throat. The metal ring around his neck was vibrating violently, flashing from green to yellow to a frantic, stuttering red. "Caleb," Dominic choked out, his eyes wide. "It's burning." "Don't fight the anger, Dom," Caleb yelled, backing away from the dead guard and raising his baton toward the second elite, who was hesitating, clearly confused by the tactical impossibility unfolding before it. Let it out! The network is compromised. They used our tech, and our tech is failing. Get mad, kid. Let your heart race. Josiah, the elderly surgeon, let out a ragged, wheezing breath. His collar sparked, emitting a sharp puff of ozone. The locking mechanism, fried by the cascading software failure, snapped open. The heavy metal ring clattered to the obsidian floor. Josiah stared at it. For 20 years he had been a broken man. But as he looked at the severed chain of his slavery, a profound, terrifying shift occurred in his eyes. He slowly pushed himself to his feet. "They're breaking," Josiah whispered, his voice gaining a sudden, gravelly strength. He looked at the hundreds of thousands of slaves surrounding him. "The collars are breaking." It started as a murmur, a low, rumbling vibration that seemed to emanate from the very floorboards of the Aegis Prime station. Then, a crescendo of mechanical clicks and snaps rippled through the geometric formations. By the hundreds, then the thousands, the Neuralink collars began to fail. Driven by the contagious, skyrocketing heart rates of a population witnessing the impossible, the localized mesh network buckled under a tsunami of human adrenaline. Collar after collar sparked, smoked, and fell away. "Contain them!" Lord Castor shrieked from the dais, his regal composure entirely gone. He was backing away, flanked by his personal guard. "Kill them all! Activate the atmospheric incinerators!" "Do it now!" The second elite guard raised its plasma caster, sweeping it toward the dense crowd of newly freed slaves. It never fired. Dominic, screaming a battle cry that cracked with decades of unspent adolescent fury, launched himself forward. He tackled the massive alien's leg. He was swatted away like an insect, his ribs cracking audibly. But his sacrifice bought exactly 1 second of distraction. That was all humanity needed. A dozen humans swarmed the guard, then 50, then 100. They had no weapons. They were starved, bruised, and wearing rags. But they had the numbers, and they had 20 years of hell to repay. They tore at the alien's armor with bare hands, using chunks of discarded collars to bash at the visor, ripping the hydraulic lines with their teeth if they had to. The elite guard disappeared beneath a surging wave of gray tunics. The riot didn't just start, it exploded. The grand atrium descended into absolute mythological chaos. The klaxons wailed, drowning under the roar of 100,000 human voices. It was a sound that had not been heard in the galaxy for 2 decades. The sound of a predator species waking up. "Push forward!" Caleb roared, hauling Dominic to his feet and shoving the plasma baton into the kid's hands. "Take the weapons! Aim for the joints! Do not let them reorganize!" All across the cavernous dome, the remaining elite guards were being overwhelmed. The Ascendancy had built their military doctrine on precise, overwhelming technological superiority. They were entirely unequipped for asymmetrical, suicidal, close-quarters combat against an enemy that simply did not care if they died, so long as they took an alien with them. Plasma fire scarred the obsidian walls, but for every human that fell, 10 more stepped over their body, picking up their momentum. Caleb didn't join the swarm. He had a different target. His eyes were locked on the massive, elevated dais at the far end of the atrium. Lord Castor was retreating toward the heavily armored blast doors that led to the station's command spire. If Castor escaped, he would order the orbital fleet to turn their macro cannons on Sector 4. Aegis Prime would be vaporized, along with every human on it. The rebellion would be a 3-minute glitch in the Ascendancy's history. Caleb sprinted. He dodged a wild spray of plasma fire, vaulted over the crushed body of an Ascendancy guard, and snatched a heavy subparticle heavy pistol from the alien's dead grip. The weapon was massive, designed for hands twice his size, but he braced it against his forearm, his engineering mind instantly calculating the trigger mechanism. He hit the base of the dais just as the blast doors began to slide open behind Castor. 4 personal guards stood between the High Arbiter and the exit, raising heavy energy shields. "Castor!" Caleb's voice tore through the chaotic din, amplified by the station's acoustics that had not yet been disabled. The High Arbiter paused, looking down from the top of the stairs. His glowing eyes were filled with a mixture of abhorrence and genuine fear. Caleb didn't aim at the guards. He aimed the subparticle pistol upward, past the dais, toward the massive, glowing containment struts that suspended the captive star reactor at the zenith of the atrium. It was the heart of the refinery, a churning mass of volatile dark matter isotopes kept stable by a delicate web of electromagnetic tethers. I was the chief engineer of the Artemis lunar grid, Caleb yelled, his finger tightening on the heavy trigger. I know how containment fields work, Castor, and I know what happens if I put a subparticle slug through the primary magnetic convergence coil of that reactor. Castor froze. The alien guards halted their advance. You would incinerate the entire station, Castor projected, his voice trembling through the acoustic field. You would destroy yourself and every Terran in this sector. It is an illogical bluff. Your biological imperative is survival. Caleb let out a harsh, barking laugh. It was a terrifying sound, devoid of sanity, forged in the dark minds of Sector 4. Survival? You think we care about survival anymore? We grew up in the shadow of the atomic bomb, Castor. Mutually assured destruction is our birthright. You pushed us past the fear of death 20 years ago. Now, all we want is to take you with us. Caleb cocked the heavy weapon, the audible whine of its capacitor charging echoing sharply. Tell them to drop the shields or I turn this entire orbital facility into a miniature supernova. I swear to God, I'll do it. For a long, agonizing moment, the High Arbiter calculated the odds. The Ascendancy mind was purely rational, incapable of grasping the suicidal spite of a conquered people. Castor looked at the man below him, bleeding, ragged, holding a weapon too large for him, yet radiating an aura of absolute, terrifying certainty. Castor realized with a sinking dread that the human wasn't bluffing. Stand down, Castor whispered to his guards. The towering elites hesitated, then slowly deactivated their energy shields, lowering their weapons. Caleb marched up the steps of the dais, the subparticle pistol still leveled at the reactor above, until he stood face to face with the High Arbiter. Up close, the alien was even taller, but his aura of supremacy had entirely vanished. You have won nothing, Castor hissed, his voice dropping the acoustic projection, speaking in a low, venomous tone. My fleet orbits this station. The moment this riot is quelled, your homeworld will be glassed. We will scour humanity from the genetic registry of the universe. Your fleet, Caleb said, his voice deadly quiet, is currently watching this. He gestured with his free hand toward the floating holocam droids, which were still diligently broadcasting the feed to the entire galactic network. The automated systems, programmed to capture the triumph of the Ascendancy, were now broadcasting its greatest humiliation in stunning high definition. Across thousands of star systems, billions of Ascendancy citizens and billions of human slaves in orbital shipyards, deep core mines, and agricultural death camps were watching. Caleb stepped into Castor's personal space, the barrel of the alien pistol pressing hard against the fine silk of the High Arbiter's crimson robes. 20 years ago, you came to our home and demanded we bow, Caleb said, his voice echoing out across the network. You told us we were biologically destined to serve. You built an empire on the illusion that you were untouchable. Caleb shifted his weight, kicking the back of Castor's elongated knee with brutal precision. The alien lord gasped, his leg buckling under the sudden, agonizing strike. But illusions, Caleb whispered, leaning in close as the High Arbiter collapsed downward, shatter easily. Castor hit the obsidian floor of the dais. The image was broadcast across the stars, undeniable and permanent. High Arbiter Castor of the Ascendancy, draped in gold and crimson, kneeling on the blood-stained glass at the feet of a human slave. Down in the atrium, the fighting paused. The humans looked up at the screens. The surviving Ascendancy guards looked up. Broadcast this on all frequencies, Caleb ordered the AI network, his voice ringing with the authority of a new era. To every human, on every rock in this galaxy. The collars are broken. The Empire is bleeding. Stand up. Take their ships. Take their weapons. And bring them down. Caleb looked down at Castor, whose glowing blue eyes were wide with the realization of the absolute ruin he had just witnessed. We are humanity, Caleb said. The subparticle pistol aimed directly at the kneeling lord's head. And we don't kneel anymore. The galactic broadcast cut to black, but the signal had already been sent. The spark had caught. The wildfire had begun. And the Ascendancy, for the first time in 10,000 years, knew exactly what it felt like to be afraid. They demanded submission, but humanity gave them a masterclass in mutually assured destruction. Caleb didn't just break his chains. He exposed the fatal flaw in the Ascendancy's stolen tech, and broadcast their ultimate humiliation to the stars. The Empire's greatest mistake wasn't conquering Earth, it was forgetting that humans are born in the fire. If you felt the adrenaline of this uprising, smash that like button, share this with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. The galaxy is burning, and you won't want to miss the war that comes next.
Hi, my name is Tran Trung, the owner-manager of Palace Truths. After watching the video, they ordered the human slave to kneel, and the entire empire shook when he said no, HFY sci-fi. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? For me, the strongest feeling was determination. What stayed with me wasn't just Caleb's single act of defiance, but how one decision inspired countless others to believe they still had a choice. The story reminds us that courage often begins with one person refusing to accept that things can never change. I'm curious which moment had the biggest impact on you. Was it when Caleb remained standing? The instant he simply said no? Or the moment others found the courage to rise with him? And if you had been in that crowd, do you think you would have found the strength to stand? Or would you have waited until someone else took the first step? One lesson I took from this story is that conviction can be contagious when it's backed by integrity and courage. In everyday life, speaking up respectfully for what you believe in can encourage others to do the same. If this story gave you something to think about or kept you hooked until the end, I'd love to hear your perspective in the comments. And if you enjoy HFY stories about resilience, hope, and the unbreakable human spirit, feel free to like the video or subscribe if you think it's worth your time.